What if the person who built your dreams was also the one who broke them? Picture this. You're 13 years old. You're handed a once-in-a-lifetime chance to star in a film that will define a generation. But behind the glittering lights, you're being fed pills you don't understand, weighed every morning like livestock, and told you're too fat to be famous. The man who gave you the opportunity also controls what you eat, who you love, and even how you sleep. And if you fail to comply, he reminds you you're irreplaceable. This isn't fiction. This was Hollywood. And the man at the center of it all was Louis B. Mayer, a co-founder of MGM, the so-called father of the Dream Factory, and one of the most powerful men to ever walk the halls of Hollywood. But here's the question nobody really wants to ask out loud. Was Mayer a genius who shaped an entire art form? Or was he a tyrant who weaponized power, appearance, and fear to control others for profit? Welcome to Tragedy Uncovered, the channel where we don't just admire legends but investigate the price of becoming one. If you've ever watched Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, or admired the timeless beauty of what you're about to hear may challenge everything you thought you knew. Because behind the velvet curtains of class, a machine that ran on silence, secrets, and suffering. And Mayer? He didn't just operate the machine. He built it, engineered it, and at times, rigged it to break the very stars he created. In this episode, we're not just walking through Mayer's rise to power, we're dissecting it. We're going to ask the hard questions most documentaries avoid. Was Judy Garland just a tragic exception, or a carefully suppressed template? Were these stars really discovered, or were they forged under pressure like diamonds and sometimes shattered just as easily? We'll retrace Mayer's path from immigrant poverty to millionaire mogul. We'll expose the contracts that dictated women's wombs, the arranged marriages meant to cover up sexual identities, and the fixers who cleaned up literal and figurative bloodstains to preserve the image of the American dream. But more than anything, we'll hold a mirror up to the culture that enabled it, a culture that still, even now, struggles to separate brilliance from abuse, charisma from coercion, and in doing so, we'll ask how many legends did we applaud while they were quietly begging for help? How many more stories like Garland's remain untold? How much of what we love was built on what others couldn't survive? If this is the kind of truth you believe deserves daylight, then subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered right now. Because some legends aren't remembered for what they created but for what they destroyed along the way. Let's begin. To understand the grip Louis B. Mayer held over Hollywood's golden age, you first have to understand how tightly he clung to survival in his own life. Born in 1884 in the crumbling edge of the Russian Empire, Mayer was not destined for opulence or influence. He was the son of Jewish immigrants who fled anti-Semitic persecution in Eastern Europe, only to find a different kind of hardship waiting for them in North America. Poverty wasn't just a phase, it was their entire world. English was foreign, opportunities were rare, and failure wasn't an option. Mayer dropped out of school at 12, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. He spent his teenage years scavenging for scrap metal to help feed his family. While other future moguls studied business or law, Mayer learned how to survive in junkyards. But in that grim trade, he developed two skills that would become his superpowers in Hollywood: the ability to hustle, and the ability to sell a dream that wasn't real. By his early 20s, Mayer had moved to Boston and was still in the salvage business, but something else had started tugging at him. Not a love for storytelling, not yet, but a fascination with performance, with illusion, with what happens when an audience is swept away. In 1907, he bought a dilapidated burlesque theater. On paper, it was a bad investment. But Mayer wasn't interested in what was on paper, he was interested in what could be projected onto the screen. He turned that failing venue into a functioning movie house. The first film he screened? A religious epic titled From the Manger to the Cross. It wasn't art that drew him in, it was the power of mass attention. The money, the influence, the control. By the 1910s, Mayer was operating a small theater empire across New England. His real breakthrough came when he bought the distribution rights to The Birth of a Nation. Sight unseen, the film became a box office sensation, but it also glorified the Ku Klux Klan and promoted overtly racist narratives. Mayer didn't care. He wasn't chasing truth or justice, he was chasing momentum. He made hundreds of thousands from that decision and never once apologized for it. Because in Mayer's world, the ends always justified the means. By 1918, he'd moved to Los Angeles and started his own production company. He was shrewd, fast, and completely unapologetic about using personal charm as a business weapon. It was during this time he met a man who would become both his golden boy and his safety net, Irving Thalberg. Thalberg was everything Mayer was: quiet, cerebral, and deeply invested in the art of storytelling. He believed in character, depth, complexity. Mayer, on the other hand, believed in what he called wholesome American values, which really meant palatable, family-friendly stories that sold well in the Midwest. But their dynamic worked. Mayer handled the image, the contracts, the money. Thalberg handled the content. It was a machine built on imbalance, and it worked brilliantly. In 1924, that machine got turbocharged. Mayer's company merged with two others to form Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. It wasn't just a studio, it was a new kind of empire. One that had no intention of reflecting real life. Instead, it manufactured an idealized version of America that millions around the world were desperate to believe in. And Mayer? He positioned himself not as a producer, but as a patriarch. He wasn't the man behind the curtain. He was front and center, shaping every decision, every contract, every image. He didn't just want control. He demanded submission. Even though he technically reported to studio boss Nicholas Schenck, Mayer still behaved like a monarch. He openly called Schenck Mr. Skunk behind his back. He hated being subordinate, but he found ways to maneuver power anyway. It wasn't about tight light, it was about reach. Mayer's fingerprints were on every starlet's makeover, every marriage arranged for PR, every press release drafted to deflect scandal. Nothing happened in MGM without his approval. But his greatest obsession wasn't money, it was image. Mayer believed that audiences didn't just want stories. They wanted people to worship. Icons. Faces that represented something larger than life. And if reality didn't provide the perfection he needed, he would fabricate it. Acting skill? Optional. Raw talent? Irrelevant. Beauty? Mandatory. In Mayer's world, stars weren't born. They were sculpted. Their names changed. Their teeth fixed. Their noses shaved. Their accents erased. Their childhoods rewritten. And if a body didn't fit the mold, it was altered by force, if necessary. This was not mentorship. It was control masquerading as care. Benevolence hiding behind branding. And the longer Mayer succeeded, the more convinced he became that his way wasn't just effective, it was righteous. But while his empire glittered from the outside, the cracks were already forming inside. If Mayer's empire was built on illusion, then its engine ran on obedience. And nothing embodied that more than how he managed the people who gave MGM its shine, the stars. For Mayer, a contract wasn't just a legal agreement. It was a leash. He didn't believe in letting talent shape itself organically. That was risky. That was inefficient. Instead, he believed in what he called star-making, a system that took young hopefuls and refashioned them from the ground up. It started with the face. Makeup wasn't enhancement, it was a tool of transformation. Noses were shaved, teeth replaced, waistlines cinched within inches of breathability. But those changes weren't recommendations. They were requirements. You didn't negotiate your image at MGM, you submitted to it. Even names were erased. Norma Jean became Marilyn Monroe. Lucille LeSueur became Joan Crawford. Frances Gumm? She became Judy Garland. Your past didn't matter. Your name didn't matter. Your trauma didn't matter. What mattered was whether you could smile under studio lights and make strangers believe you were happy. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. The real damage came from what Mayer did behind closed doors, what he expected, demanded, and enforced with an almost clerical cruelty. Take Judy Garland. Mayer discovered her when she was just 13. She wasn't what MGM traditionally wanted in a female lead. She wasn't tall. Her features were considered irregular. Mayer himself gave her a nickname, My Little Hunchback, a phrase laced with both mockery and ownership. And yet, he saw something in her voice, in her raw emotional resonance, that he knew he could package. What followed wasn't mentorship. It was captivity. Garland was placed into MGM's infamous acting school, which was less about developing craft and more about reshaping personality. She was told how to walk, how to speak, what to wear, what to eat, or more often, what not to eat. Unlike the other stars who were fed steak and wine on set, Garland was fed a starvation diet of black coffee, chicken broth, and stimulants. Studio doctors, yes. Doctors began administering pep pills to her as a teenager to keep her awake through long filming schedules. Then, when she couldn't sleep, they gave her barbiturates to knock her out. The cycle began early, and it never truly stopped. And yet, despite the abuse, Mayer continued to position himself as a father figure, not just to Garland, but to many of his young stars. He was known to sit them down in his office and lecture them about American morality, often invoking patriotism as a tool for compliance. He told them who they should date. He told them which headlines were appropriate. And if they stepped out of line, the mask slipped. Mickey Rooney, another MGM child star, once described Mayer as like a dad. But that same dad once grabbed Rooney by the collar and threatened him. You're an American boy and you better act like it. In Mayer's mind, personal identity had to serve public image. There was no distinction. Even adulthood offered no escape. Consider Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde bombshell whose sex appeal sold millions of tickets. Mayer reportedly inserted a no marriage clause into her contract. Why? Because a married woman couldn't sell seduction on screen. Love was off limits. Her body belonged to the studio, and so did her future. But the manipulation wasn't just limited to women. Van Johnson, a rising male star of the 1940s, became the subject of rumors, whispers about his sexual orientation that, in Mayer's eyes, posed a catastrophic threat to box office receipts. Mayer didn't wait for the tabloids to pounce. He engineered a fix. Johnson would marry Evelyn Abbott, the wife of his best friend Keenan Wynn. When Abbott initially refused, Mayer allegedly warned her that her husband's career would be over if she didn't comply. She complied. What followed was a marriage of performance, not a factiona facade that lasted for 2 decades. Mayer got his clean-cut leading man. Johnson got to keep working, and Evelyn Abbott got buried in history as collateral damage. This was the machinery, not just of a studio, but of a system that prioritized perception over people. And Mayer had people to help him maintain it. Howard Strickling and Eddie Mannix were MGM's chief fixers. Strickling controlled public relations, scrubbing scandals before they reached the front page. Mannix, however, handled the dirtier jobs. He was known to lean on police, journalists, even medical professionals, to suppress anything that could taint the MGM brand. Arrest records disappeared. Assaults went unreported. Deaths were explained away with carefully worded obituaries. And while all of this was happening, Mayer remained untouchable. He gave press conferences. He posed for photographs. He was celebrated as a champion of American values. But behind his velvet voice and perfectly groomed image was a man who understood that power didn't come from truth, it came from control. And perhaps most chilling of all, it worked. What made Louis B. Mayer's system so dangerous wasn't just the control. It was how easily that control was mistaken for care. On the surface, Mayer looked like a mentor, someone who believed in discipline, tradition, and morality. He offered actors a home, medical care, financial security, and a place in the most powerful studio in the world. But behind that surface was a culture of coercion that left deep, often irreversible, psychological scars. No star reveals this better than Judy Garland. We often remember her as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, a wide-eyed girl singing about rainbows. What we forget is that by the time Garland filmed that role, she was already addicted to the pills her studio fed her. She was 16. Every pound she gained was a crisis for MGM. She was constantly weighed, measured, and judged, sometimes daily. Studio executives didn't hide it. They'd openly refer to her as the fat one or mock her behind closed doors. And Mayer, the man who claimed to see greatness in her, used affection as a weapon. There are accounts deeply troubling, ones that Mayer would touch Garland inappropriately during meetings under the pretense of comfort or praise. She was a child. She was frightened. But she also believed she owed everything to this man. That's how the system worked. Her work schedule was brutal. Garland often filmed from early morning until past midnight. When she showed signs of exhaustion, studio doctors would increase her vitamin dosage, studio slang for amphetamines. And when she couldn't sleep, barbiturates, downers. It was a chemical roller coaster designed not for health, but for output. And Mayer wasn't subtle about the stakes. For him, Judy Garland wasn't a person. She was a product, a fragile investment. If her image cracked, so did his bottom line. By the late 1940s, Garland's health was unraveling. Her performances became erratic. She started missing rehearsals. On the set of Summer Stock, she frequently broke down in tears, unable to function. MGM executives wanted to fire her, shut it all down, cut their losses. But Mayer, perhaps sensing that letting go of Garland would tarnish his legacy, intervened. He reportedly said, "Judy made this studio a fortune. The least we can do is give her one more chance." On the surface, it sounded like compassion, but the damage was already done. Garland was spiraling, and MGM's rare moment of mercy came far too late. Her next film, Royal Wedding, was meant to be her comeback. She never finished it. Missed call times, missed scenes. Eventually, she was replaced. Quietly, efficiently, just like a piece of machinery being swapped out. And Garland wasn't the only casualty of the MGM machine. Jean Harlow, blonde, sultry, adored, was another. Mayer reportedly inserted a clause into her contract banning her from marrying. Why? Because he believed that the fantasy she represented would be shattered if the public saw her as a wife. Harlow died at 26. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, was once allegedly involved in a drunk driving incident that resulted in a fatality. The story, buried for decades, suggests that MGM executives, including Mayer, found someone to take the fall. Not because Gable deserved protection, but because Mayer couldn't afford to lose him as a brand. And then there was the silent suffering. So many stars we remember today as icons: Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford. Even Marilyn Monroe spent years of their lives under carefully orchestrated contracts that dictated not just their work, but their relationships, their diets, their public opinions, and even their pregnancies. Abortions were arranged in secret. Relationships were ended by studio order. Reporters were bribed or threatened. And if a star showed signs of rebellion, there were consequences, sometimes subtle, sometimes career-ending. Van Johnson's sham marriage wasn't unique. It was a template, a fix. And it worked because the public never questioned it. They believed what the studio told them to believe. And Mayer, more than anyone, understood the psychology of audience trust. He knew that if you made the illusion beautiful enough, no one would bother to look for the pain beneath it. The real horror wasn't that Mayer orchestrated these events. It's that for decades, the system rewarded him for it. He wasn't an outlier. He was the architect. And in Hollywood's golden age, the line between paternal guidance and predatory dominance was as thin as a strip of celluloid. The studios didn't just sell movies. They sold myths. And those myths were built on the broken bodies and buried voices of people too scared, too silenced, or too manipulated to fight back. The true brilliance of Mayer's empire wasn't just how it dazzled the publicity, was how efficiently it concealed the damage happening behind the scenes. Everything at MGM operated like a clock, synchronized, polished, and tightly wound. But that precision came at a cost. The gears of that machine were greased with fear, silence, and the careful removal of anything or anyone that disrupted the fantasy. And for that, Mayer had help. He didn't just create stars. He created a culture where truth was negotiable, and scandal was a logistical problem to be solved. At the top of that shadow hierarchy stood two men whose names never appeared on movie posters, but whose fingerprints were on every crisis MGM faced: Howard Strickling and Eddie Mannix. Strickling was the publicist, the front-facing fixer. He specialized in controlling narratives. If a scandal threatened to surface, Strickling would swoop in with press releases, staged photographs, and exclusive interviews designed to reshape the story before it took on a life of its own. Newspapers worked with him, not against him, because the studio paid well and because Hollywood was a city built on access. You don't bite the hand that feeds you stories. But Mannix? He operated deeper in the shadows. He was Mayer's enforcer. If an actress became pregnant out of wedlock, Mannix arranged the abortion. If a star was arrested in a compromising situation, Mannix made it disappear. If a fight turned violent, if a scandal involved violence, drugs, or something worse, found a way to contain it. Sometimes, containment meant threats. Other times, it meant deals. And on occasion, it meant finding someone willing to take the blame. This wasn't rumor. This was structure. Everyone at MGM knew that protection came with obedience. Stars who played along were rewarded. Those who didn't, quietly replaced, publicly humiliated, or left to wither in obscurity. Contracts were cut. Projects were recast. Opportunities evaporated without explanation. No blacklists, just silence. Even death wasn't off limits. When MGM's prized icon Jean Harlow died suddenly at age 26, questions swirled. She'd complained of fatigue, bloating, and severe pain for weeks. But by the time she reached the hospital, it was too late. Renal failure. Acute. Untreated. Some believed studio demands delayed her treatment. Others suggested she was too afraid to speak, afraid of being labeled difficult or unreliable. In Mayer's world, health was a secondary concern. Image came first. And if someone threatened that image, the response was swift. There's a chilling story involving a young actress named Jean Howard. Striking, talented, independent. Mayer pursued her not professionally, but personally. One version of the story claims he literally chased her across a studio room, demanding she cooperate. She refused. Not just his advances, but his control. She married someone else. And Mayer's retaliation was quiet but effective. Roles stopped coming. Invitations dried up. In Hollywood, resistance wasn't punished with scandal, it was punished with invisibility. Even more disturbing are the whispers around Clark Gable, the legendary leading man of Gone with the Wind. Allegedly, he was involved in a drunk driving accident that resulted in someone's death. But instead of facing the law, Gable walked away with his career intact. Why? Because Mayer arranged for another MGM employee to take the fall. A convenient switch. A carefully packaged truth. No headlines. No courtroom. Just business as usual. And this pattern didn't just affect the victims. It infected the culture. Actors learned to stay silent. Crew members knew what not to say. And audiences, unknowingly, became complicit, cheering for stars whose pain had been repackaged into inspiration. This wasn't just about Meyer's power. It was about how thoroughly he rewrote the rules of accountability in Hollywood. He created an environment where loyalty wasn't earned, it was extracted, where reputations were manufactured, and real lives were edited out of existence. And through it all, Mayer maintained his public persona. He cried on cue, told heartwarming stories about his stars, and preached about family values. But those tears, many said, were just another performance. A tactic. A manipulation. Cole Porter, one of the era's greatest composers, once clashed with Mayer over a song that Nelson Eddy refused to sing. Mayer had Porter play the piece in his office. As Porter played, Mayer began to sob uncontrollably. Overwhelmed. Moved. He begged Eddy to reconsider. And Eddy, uncomfortable with Meyer's apparent sincerity, eventually caved. But people close to the situation said the tears weren't real. Mayer knew how to push emotional buttons, she just didn't feel them himself. That's the legacy he left behind. A man who understood people so well that he could break them without ever raising his voice. And by the time anyone realized the depth of the damage, it was already baked into the industry's DNA. For decades, Mayer ruled with velvet gloves wrapped around an iron fist. But even empires built on illusion eventually collide with reality. And when that collision came, Mayer found himself suddenly and for the first time obsolete. By the late 1940s, the world had changed. The war had ended. But the shadows it left behind remained. Audiences were no longer satisfied with candy-coated fairy tales or moral absolutes. They wanted complexity. They wanted grit. And most of all, they wanted truth. But Mayer wasn't built for truth. He was built for control. He kept pushing the same stories: wholesome romances, idealized families, sanitized conflicts, while new directors were emerging with stories about fractured lives, moral ambiguity, and the cost of pretending everything was fine. Meyer's sensibilities, once revolutionary, were now outdated. He wasn't evolving. He was clinging. Internally, the boardrooms of MGM were shifting. Executives who once revered him were now whispering about budgets, excess, and the need for fresh leadership. The very system Mayer created was now turning on him, not out of moral awakening, but out of economics. In 1951, the inevitable happened. Mayer was pushed out. It wasn't public. It wasn't dramatic. But it was final. The man who had once called every shot at the most powerful studio on earth was now outside the gates. Looking in, there was no parade, no standing ovation, just silence and the uncomfortable reality that his era had ended, and the world had moved on without him. Still, Mayer refused to disappear. He made one last attempt at legacy, investing in a new cinematic format called Cinerama. He hoped to revolutionize the movie-going experience with 3 synchronized projectors and a massive curved screen. The idea was bold, spectacle on a scale never seen before. It had Meyer's fingerprints all over it, big, loud, breathtaking. But he misread the moment. Again, while Mayer was betting on theatrical grandeur, America was falling in love with something else: television, small screens, domestic storytelling, intimacy, the very opposite of everything Mayer had built his empire on. In 1954, just a few years after launching Cinerama, he withdrew from the project. The future no longer had a place for him. 3 years later, In 1957, Mayer died of leukemia. He was 73. Hollywood responded with formality. He was given an honorary Oscar, a theater in his name, a star on the Canadian Walk of Fame. The tributes were clean, respectful, predictable, but beneath the surface, the air was thick with mixed emotions. Some mourned a visionary. Others whispered about what he had buried, and many more, especially the ones who had worked under his thumb, stayed silent. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of fatigue, or perhaps because they knew that no obituary could capture the complexity of who Mayer really was. At his memorial, the stars came out, the protégés, the moguls, the faces he'd sculpted, and among them stood comedian Red Skelton, who delivered the final words. Like he used to say, Skelton quipped, "Give the public what they want, and they always show up." And they did, not just for the man, but for the idea he represented. The Dream Factory, the shining screen where every problem was solvable, every face flawless, and every ending happy. But now, decades later, we're left asking, at what cost? How many Garlands broke down behind the curtains? How many marriages were destroyed for the sake of an image? How many crimes were covered, reputations bought, and lives rewritten, all in the name of something that looked perfect on a billboard? Mayer wasn't simply a tyrant, nor was he simply a pioneer. He was both. A man who understood the power of storytelling, but not its responsibility. A man who built something that millions admired, even as it consumed the very people who made it run. And that's the paradox of Louis B. Mayer. He created legends, but only after erasing the truth. He brought joy to the masses while enforcing misery on the vulnerable. He gave the public what they wanted but took away from his stars what they needed most: autonomy, dignity, and sometimes even their sanity. His legacy isn't just Hollywood history. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked, when success is mistaken for virtue, and when we, as an audience, become so enchanted by the spotlight that we stop looking at who's burning in it. So maybe the real tragedy of Louis B. Mayer isn't just what he did, but how long it worked. How long we applauded, unaware or unwilling to ask what it cost the people behind the curtain. How often we accepted the dream, without ever questioning who had to live the nightmare to create it. Mayer didn't just build Hollywood. He built the blueprint for how power protects itself, how image becomes more important than integrity, how a smiling face on a magazine cover can conceal a lifetime of control, manipulation, and pain. And if we're honest, how many versions of that still exist today? Maybe the scariest part isn't what Mayer got away with back then, but how familiar it all still feels now. In every industry, every institution, every place where charisma outweighs character, and where silence becomes the price of survival. So what do we do with legacies like his? Do we erase them? Or do we examine them truthfully? Fully so we stop repeating the same pattern with different names? That answer, maybe, is up to all of us. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. And if you believe these stories matter, if you believe truth still deserves to be heard, then subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered to make sure you never miss the facts they don't want you to know. Until next time, stay curious and take care.